Section 1. The Foundation of Stone. The old farmhouse stood as a silent testament to a lifetime of labor. For Elias Thorne, its worn floorboards and sun-bleached siding were not just wood and nail. They were the pages of his history. Every creak was a memory, every scent of dust and dried hay a chapter of his 72 years. He had been born in the front room, had courted his late wife, Eleanor, on the porch swing, and had raised their son, David, within these walls that had witnessed both joy and profound sorrow. Now the land itself felt tired. The once rich soil seemed to resist his efforts, and the bank statements on the heavy oak desk in his study spoke a language of quiet despair. The latest one was stark, the numbers in red a final, grim pronouncement. Foreclosure. The word echoed in the silence of the house, a death knell for a legacy. David, his only child, had come from the city for the weekend. Elias could hear him moving about in the kitchen, the sound of city shoes on country linoleum. David was a man of spreadsheets and strategic plans, a successful project manager who believed every problem had a logical, actionable solution. He saw the farm not as a soul but as an asset, and a failing one at that. "Dad," David said, entering the study with 2 mugs of coffee. He placed one on the desk, his eyes falling on the bank notice. "We need to talk about this. It's time to be realistic. Sell the place. There are developers who would pay a fortune for this land. You could retire comfortably, travel, be free of all this worry." Elias picked up the mug, the warmth a small comfort against the chill in his bones. "This isn't just land, David. It's your heritage. It's all I have left of your mother. Mom wouldn't have wanted you to kill yourself over a pile of memories," David said, his voice softening but his resolve firm. "You've trusted your own 2 hands your whole life. You've worked harder than any man I know. But sometimes you have to acknowledge when the fight is over. Lean on your own understanding, Dad. The numbers don't lie. Lean on your own understanding." The phrase struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It was the antithesis of the verse that had been the bedrock of his life, the one Eleanor had embroidered on a sampler that still hung in their bedroom. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." He looked at his son, a man shaped by a world of data and deadlines. "My understanding is tired, son," Elias admitted, his voice a low rumble. "But selling feels like a betrayal of her, of everything we built." "It's not a betrayal, it's a business decision," David countered. "Be logical." After David left, promising to return in a week to help get things in order, Elias walked out onto the porch. The sunset painted the sky in hues of fire and gold, a masterpiece over the fields he had plowed since he was a boy. He felt a profound conflict. David's argument was, by all earthly logic, impeccable. The farm was no longer viable. His strength was waning. The sensible thing was to let it go. But a deeper voice, one that felt woven into the very soil, whispered of another way. It was the voice of the proverb, of a trust that went beyond balance sheets and soil samples. That night, kneeling by the bed he had shared with Eleanor for 45 years, Elias did the only thing he could. He prayed, not for a miracle but for direction. "Lord," he whispered into the quiet dark, "my understanding has run out. My strength is gone. I don't know the way. I'm trying to trust. Show me your way." It was not a prayer of triumphant faith, but one of desperate surrender. And in that surrender, he found a fragile, flickering peace. He would not list the farm. Not yet. For the first time in his life, he would actively, consciously choose not to lean on his own crumbling understanding. He would wait. Section 2. The Unlikely Answer. The morning after his prayer, the world looked the same, yet everything felt different. The weight of the decision was still there, but it was no longer his alone to carry. He went through his chores with a quiet deliberateness, no longer fueled by panic, but by a patient, watchful hope. He was waiting for a sign, though he had no idea what form it might take. It arrived 3 days later in the form of a beat-up pickup truck kicking up dust on the long gravel driveway. A young man with an earnest face and calloused hands got out. He introduced himself as Ben, a recent graduate from the State Agricultural College. Mr. Thorne, Ben said, extending a hand. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. My professor, Dr. Albright, spoke very highly of your farm. He said you've been working this land for decades. Elias nodded warily. That's right. What can I do for you, son? Ben's eyes shone with an enthusiasm that Elias hadn't felt in years. I'm doing my thesis on sustainable soil regeneration, specifically for overfarmed plots in this region. Dr. Albright mentioned your soil tests from a few years back showed signs of severe depletion. I was wondering, would you be willing to let me try some experimental organic methods on one of your fallow fields? I do all the work. I wouldn't charge you a dime. I just need a real-world laboratory. Elias was stunned. It was as if his prayer had been answered with a blueprint he could never have conceived. His own understanding would have led him to apply for another bank loan for more chemical fertilizer, a solution that had failed before. This was different. It was new and proven and entirely out of his realm of experience. His first instinct was to say no. It was a risk. It was the opposite of leaning on his own understanding. But the memory of his surrender by the bedside was fresh. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. It's a big ask, Ben said, misreading Elias's silence. I understand if you're hesitant. No, Elias said, the word feeling foreign and right on his tongue. No, I'm not hesitant. I'm interested. Show me what you have in mind. For the next hour, Ben spread maps and charts on the hood of his truck, talking about mycorrhizal fungi, cover crops, and no-till practices. It was a language Elias barely understood, a world away from the traditional farming he'd always known. It required trust of a different kind, not in his own seasoned knowledge, but in the passion of a stranger and the wisdom of a process he couldn't fully grasp. He thought of David's words. Be logical. This was not logical. It was a gamble, but the flicker of peace he'd felt the night before grew stronger. This was a path, however strange it seemed. You can have the 10-acre south field, Elias said finally, pointing to the most tired patch of land on the property. Do what you need to do. Ben's face broke into a wide grin. You won't regret this, Mr. Thorne. I promise. As Ben drove away, Elias looked at the weary field. He had just entrusted a part of his legacy, the very thing he was fighting to save, to a method he didn't comprehend. He had chosen, for the first time, not to lean on his own understanding, but to acknowledge a higher way. And in that acknowledgement, he felt a seedling of hope break through the hard-packed soil of his fear. Section 3. The Clash of Kingdoms. David returned the following Friday, his car sleek and out of place against the rustic backdrop of the farm. He was carrying a folder thick with papers, listing agreements, market analyses, offers from interested development firms. He was ready for a battle, prepared to use every logical weapon in his arsenal to convince his stubborn father. I've got 3 solid offers, Dad, he announced, spreading the documents on the kitchen table. This one from Heritage Homes is particularly strong. It would set you up for life. Elias listened, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. He felt a strange calm. I appreciate all this work, David. I truly do. But I'm not going to sell. David's shoulders slumped in frustration. Why not? What's changed? Is this about Mom? Because I miss her too. But we can't live in a museum. It's not a museum, son. It's still a working farm. Elias took a deep breath. A young man from the AG College came by. Ben, he's going to help me rejuvenate the south field with some new methods. David stared at him, incredulous. A student? Dad, are you serious? You're going to trust the fate of this farm to some college kid's science project? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not thinking clearly. You're leaning on a fantasy. The phrase hung in the air. Leaning on a fantasy. To David, it was. To Elias, it was the first step of true trust he'd taken in a long time. He's passionate and he knows his stuff, Elias said, his voice steady. It's a new way, maybe a better one. A new way. David's voice rose. Your way, the way you've always done it, is what got us here. Your understanding of this land has led to foreclosure notices. And now, When it's time to face facts, you're chasing a pipe dream. He picked up the offers, shaking them. This is understanding. This is logic. This is the real world. Elias met his son's angry gaze. The peace he felt was a fragile shield against David's storm of reason. I know you believe that, and a part of me believes it too. It's the part that's scared. But there's another part, David, that knows there's a wisdom higher than ours. I'm choosing to listen to that part. So that's it? You're just going to trust God and hope it all works out? That's your plan. David's tone was laced with a bitterness that surprised Elias. It wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was a clash of fundamental worldviews. It's the only plan I have left, Elias said softly. I have to trust that his way is better than my own, even when it doesn't make a lick of sense to you or to me. David gathered his papers, his movements sharp with disappointment. I can't watch you do this, Dad. I can't stand by and watch you throw everything away on a prayer. He walked out, the screen door slamming shut behind him, a sound of finality. Elias stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The conflict with his son was a fresh wound, deeper than the financial worries. He had chosen to trust in a way he could not see, and the first cost was a chasm between himself and his only child. The path of trust, he was learning, was often a lonely one. Section 4. The labor of trust. With David's departure, a heavy silence descended upon the farm. Elias threw himself into the new routine, not as a master, but as a student. Ben arrived every morning at dawn, his energy boundless. Together, they began the slow, unglamorous work of healing the land. Elias watched as Ben planted not cash crops, but a mix of clover and vetch, plants he would have once dismissed as weeds. They fix nitrogen, Ben explained, and their roots break up the compacted soil. It's like giving the earth a deep massage and a vitamin shot at the same time. It was a lesson in patience. There were no immediate results, no overnight transformations. This was not the quick fix of industrial farming. This was a process of cooperation with nature, of working with its rhythms instead of forcing his will upon it. It required Elias to unlearn a lifetime of habits. He had to trust that the invisible work beneath the soil, the work of microbes and fungi, was more important than the visible work above it. He found himself thinking of the proverb constantly. In all your ways acknowledge him. It wasn't just about the big, desperate prayers in the dark of night. It was about acknowledging God in the small things, in the feel of the soil, in Ben's patient explanations, in the stubborn hope that pushed through the grief of his rift with David. One afternoon, as they were building a complex compost tea brewer, a contraption that looked utterly ridiculous to Elias's traditional eyes, Ben looked at him. You know, Mr. Thorne, most farmers my professor sent me to laugh me right off their land. Why did you say yes? Elias leaned on the fence post, looking out at the field that was now a patchwork of green shoots. Because my own way had run its course, he said honestly. I was out of answers. Sometimes you have to admit you don't know everything to make room for a new kind of knowing. Ben nodded thoughtfully. That's pretty much the foundation of science, too. As the weeks turned into a month, Elias noticed a change not just in the field but in himself. The frantic anxiety began to recede, replaced by a quiet curiosity. He was no longer carrying the burden alone. He was a participant in a process guided by a wisdom greater than his own. The labor was hard, but it was a shared labor. He was learning to trust not just God, but the people and the processes God had placed in his path. The 10-acre plot began to show subtle signs of life. The soil, once hard and cracked, grew softer, darker. Earthworms, once a rarity, began to appear. It was a small victory, but to Elias it was a miracle. It was the first tangible evidence that trusting in a way he did not understand was bearing fruit. The path was still unclear, the financial pressure still immense, but he was no longer walking it blind. He was learning to see with new eyes. Section 5. The Test of Fire. Just as a fragile hope was taking root, the test came. It arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar. A late summer thunderstorm, violent and electric, lashed against the farmhouse. Elias watched from the window as lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the land in stark, terrifying flashes. The wind howled, and the rain fell not in drops but in sheets. Then he saw it. A brilliant, blinding fork of lightning struck the old oak tree on the hill behind the house. A loud crack echoed over the storm's din, and a moment later, a shower of sparks erupted. The tree, dry from a week of heat, caught fire instantly. The driving wind hurled embers like fiery rain towards the barn and the farmhouse. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elias. This was his deepest fear. Fire, the destroyer of everything. His own understanding screamed at him to act, to grab the hose, to call the volunteer fire department, to fight with every ounce of his strength. He ran out into the torrential rain, his heart hammering against his ribs. But the wind was too strong, the fire too hungry. The old oak was a torch, and the embers were already igniting the dry grass on the slope. The barn, filled with winter hay, was a tinderbox. His own efforts were pathetic, useless against the elemental fury. In that moment of utter helplessness, the words of the proverb returned, not as a gentle whisper, but as a command. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, not just when it's easy, not just when the sun is shining. Now, in the storm, in the fire, he stopped, the futility of his frantic efforts washing over him. He looked up at the raging sky, the rain stinging his face. "I trust you," he shouted into the wind, his voice raw. "I don't understand this. This feels like the end of everything, but I trust your way, even in this." It was the hardest thing he had ever done. To stand still in the face of annihilation and declare trust felt like madness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind shifted. A powerful gust, born of the storm's own chaotic energy, turned and blew from the east, pushing the wall of fire and the shower of embers back upon itself, away from the barn and the house, towards the already burning tree and the bare, stony patch of the hill behind it. The rain intensified, becoming a biblical deluge. It fell upon the redirected fire, quenching it, turning the blaze into a hissing, smoking ruin. Within minutes, the immediate danger was over. The barn was safe. The house was safe. Elias stood, soaked and shivering, watching the steam rise from the blackened hill. The old oak was a charred skeleton, but it had become a sacrifice. He had done nothing. His own understanding and strength had accomplished nothing. But in his surrender, in his active trust in the midst of the storm, the way had been made. The fire had been contained not by his hand, but by a shift in the wind he could never have orchestrated. The test had been brutal, but his trust had held. And it had been enough. Section 6. The First Fruits. The morning after the storm dawned clear and clean, the air washed fresh. The smell of rain and wet earth had replaced the acrid scent of smoke. Elias walked the perimeter of the farm, assessing the damage. The hill was scarred, the old oak gone, but the vital structures were untouched. It felt like a baptism. He made his way to the 10-acre field, half expecting Ben's careful work to have been washed away by the torrential rains. But what he saw made him stop in his tracks. The field was not destroyed. It was revitalized. The cover crops, strengthened by their deep roots, had held the soil fast, preventing the erosion that had plagued other parts of the farm. The rain had been absorbed into the now spongy, healthy earth, a reservoir of moisture for the future. It was the first undeniable fruit of trusting a way that was not his own. Ben arrived later, his face full of concern about the storm. When he saw the field, his worry turned to triumph. "The soil structure held," he exclaimed, kneeling down and squeezing a handful of earth. "It's perfect, Mr. Thorne. This is it. This is proof." A few weeks later, Ben proposed the next phase. "It's time to plant the main crop, but not corn, not soybeans. I want to try something different. Heirloom varieties. A special kind of drought-resistant wheat and a purple potato that chefs in the city are paying a premium for. It's a niche market, but a lucrative one." Again, it was a step into the unknown. Heirloom crops were finicky, the market was uncertain. Leaning on his own understanding, Elias would have never considered it. But the evidence was before him. The field was healthier than it had been in 20 years. The fire had been thwarted. Ben's strange methods worked. "Let's do it," Elias said, the decision coming more easily this time. As they planted the unusual seeds, Elias felt a profound shift. He was no longer just a farmer trying to save his land. He was a steward participating in a renewal he hadn't engineered. The success of this venture was no longer solely dependent on his effort or intelligence. He was a partner in a process guided by a wisdom that understood the soil, the weather, and the market in ways he never could. The first green shoots of the heirloom wheat broke through the soil, a vibrant, healthy green he hadn't seen on his land in a decade. They were fragile, but they were alive. They represented a future that was not a desperate clinging to the past, but a hopeful step into a new, unexpected way. He began to understand that trust was not a passive state of waiting for miracles. It was an active partnership. It was doing the work, planting the strange seeds, building the compost brewer, mending the fences, but doing it with an open hand, acknowledging that the ultimate growth and outcome were in hands far more capable than his own. The fruits of this trust were no longer just a hope. They were sprouting from the earth before his very eyes. Section 7, The Prodigal. The success of the new field was a quiet affair, known only to Elias and Ben. The financial pressure, while lessened by the lack of expensive fertilizers and pesticides, was still a grim reality. The bank notices continued to arrive, their tone growing more formal, more final. One evening, as Elias was reviewing the latest notice, he saw David's car coming up the driveway. His heart clenched. He hadn't spoken to his son since their bitter argument weeks ago. David got out slowly. He looked tired, the confident posture of the city executive softened by what looked like worry. He didn't carry a folder this time. "Dad," he said, his voice cautious. "David, come in." They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. Finally, David spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I was angry. I said things I shouldn't have. I was scared of you losing everything." "I know," Elias said. "I was scared too. Are you still going to lose it?" David asked, the question hanging in the air. Elias didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Come with me." He led David out of the house, across the yard, and to the edge of the 10-acre field. The setting sun cast a golden light over the plot. The heirloom wheat stood knee-high, a lush, green sea rippling in the gentle breeze. The purple potato plants were bushy and strong. It was a picture of health and vitality, a stark contrast to the struggling, conventional fields around it. David stared, his business-trained eyes taking in the obvious health of the crop. "What is this?" "This is Ben's work," Elias said softly. "This is what happens when you stop leaning on what you think you know and make room for a new way." He told David everything. About the prayer of surrender, about Ben's arrival, about the soil regeneration, about the night of the storm and the shifted wind. He spoke not with boasting, but with a quiet testimony. David listened, his initial skepticism giving way to a dawning realization. He was a man who respected results, and the results were undeniably here, growing out of the earth. "I've been so focused on the logical exit strategy," David said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I couldn't see any other path. I thought trusting God was just giving up. But this isn't giving up. This is partnering with someone else." He looked at his father, truly seeing him for the first time in years. "You weren't being stubborn. You were being faithful." Tears welled in Elias's eyes. "It's the hardest work I've ever done, son, and the most rewarding." David put a hand on his father's shoulder. "I was wrong, Dad. I'm sorry. Let me help. Not by selling, but by learning to trust with you. Let me see if I can use my understanding to help market this niche crop. Maybe my way has a place, too, when it's submitted to a higher one." It was a moment of grace, more precious to Elias than any financial salvation. The chasm between them was bridged not by compromise, but by a shared glimpse of a higher wisdom. The prodigal had returned, not to a feast, but to a field of hope, ready to trust his father's way. Section 8. The harvest of more than grain. The harvest of the heirloom wheat and purple potatoes was a community event. Ben had spread the word at the college, and a group of students arrived to help, their youthful energy filling the air. David was there too, not in a suit, but in old jeans, learning how to handle the scythe and fork, a smile on his face that Elias hadn't seen since he was a boy. The yield was beyond anything Elias could have imagined. The wheat was plentiful, the grains plump and golden. The potatoes were a deep, royal purple, each one a perfect tuber. But the harvest was more than just an agricultural success. A local food co-op, alerted by Ben's professor, sent a representative. He was astonished by the quality. "This is exceptional," he said, tasting a raw kernel of wheat. "The nutrient density is palpable. We'll take your entire yield, and we'll sign a contract for next year's crop at a 20% premium." David, the businessman, negotiated the deal, but his heart was in a different place. He was no longer just making a transaction. He was stewarding the fruit of his father's faith. That evening, after the co-op truck had left, laden with the first harvest, they all sat on the porch, Elias, David, and Ben. The financial threat was over. The bank would be paid. The farm was saved. But as Elias looked out at the starlit fields, he knew the real harvest was not the money in the bank or the food in the truck. The real harvest was the restored relationship with his son. It was the mentorship and future he saw in Ben's bright eyes. It was the peace that settled deep in his own soul, a peace that no market fluctuation could ever threaten. He had learned that trusting in the Lord with all his heart did not mean a life free from storms or struggles. It meant that in the midst of them he was not alone. It meant that the path, even when invisible, was sure beneath his feet. It meant that his own understanding was a limited tool, but when surrendered, it could be used for a purpose far greater than he could devise. The farm was more than saved. It was transformed. It was no longer just a piece of land he owned, but a testament to a promise. It had become a living, breathing example of Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." God had directed their paths through a college student, through a storm, through a rift with a son, and onto a new, sustainable future. The harvest was abundance in every sense of the word. Section 9. A new planting. With the immediate crisis averted and a profitable future secured, the farm entered a new season of purposeful growth. The success of the 10-acre plot became the model for the entire property. Slowly, methodically, they began to convert the other fields to the sustainable, organic methods Ben championed. David, true to his word, used his skills to build a brand around Thorne heritage crops. He told the story of the farm's turnaround, not as a business case study, but as a narrative of faith and renewal. He found markets in high-end restaurants and specialty grocers who were eager for produce with both a superior taste and a powerful story. Elias found his role changing. He was less the sole decision-maker and more the wise elder, the keeper of the land's history. He taught David and Ben the old ways, the signs of the weather, the stories of the trees, the legacy of the family that had worked this soil for generations. In return, they taught him about soil microbiology, brand identity, and the power of a connected, conscious consumer base. It was a beautiful synergy. David's understanding of business and Ben's understanding of science were no longer enemies of faith. They were its instruments, sanctified by a higher purpose. They were tools in the hand of God, directed by a trust that had first been born in desperation. One afternoon, Ben came to Elias with a new idea. "The old hill where the lightning struck, the soil is rich with ash. It's the perfect place for an orchard. Not a commercial one, but a heritage orchard. Apples, pears, plums, varieties that our grandparents ate, that have all but disappeared." Elias looked at the scarred hill, the site of his greatest fear. It was now being proposed as a place of new life. It was a perfect picture of redemption. "Let's do it," Elias said, a familiar peace settling over him, as they planted the first sapling, a rare variety of apple that Eleanor had loved. Elias felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle was continuing. The trust that had saved the farm was now being planted for future generations. He was not just leaving behind land for his son. He was leaving behind a legacy of faith. He was passing on the greatest lesson he had ever learned, that true security is not found in clinging to your own understanding, but in the courageous, daily act of trusting in a way that is infinitely wiser, a path that is always leading toward life, even when it winds through fire and storm. Section 10. The Legacy of Trust. Years later, the Thorne farm was a local landmark, a beacon of sustainable agriculture and community spirit. The old farmhouse had been repainted, its walls now echoing with the laughter of David's children. The heritage orchard on the hill was in full bloom each spring, a fragrant monument to transformation. Elias, his hair now fully white, spent his days walking the land, a contented smile often on his face. He was a living legend, not for the success of his farm, but for the depth of his faith. He was often asked to speak at local churches and community groups, and his message was always the same, simple and profound. "People ask me for the secret to the farm's turnaround," he would say, his voice still strong. "They think it was a new technique or a lucky break, but the secret was a single verse and a choice I made on my knees when I had nowhere else to turn. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." He would look out at the audience, his eyes holding a lifetime of earned wisdom. Leaning on your own understanding is our default setting. It's what feels safe. It's what my son, David, urged me to do. And there's a place for reason, don't get me wrong. But when your understanding leads you to a dead end, when your strength fails, when the storm is too great, that's when you have a choice. You can double down on your own failing wisdom, or you can do the hardest, most liberating thing imaginable. You can let go. You can trust. He would tell them the story, the foreclosure, the argument with David, Ben's arrival, the fire, the reconciliation, the harvest. He made it clear that trust was not a magic wand that made problems disappear. It was an anchor that held him fast while the storm did its worst. It was a compass that pointed true north when all other landmarks were obscured. God's way is rarely the way we would chart for ourselves, Elias concluded. It's often harder, and it always requires humility. But it is always better. It leads to life in places you expected only death. It brings reconciliation where you saw only division. It brings purpose from despair. My farm is not just a business. It is a testimony. Every blade of grass, every piece of fruit, whispers the same truth. Trust his way. As he walked back to his porch at the end of the day, he would run his hand along the wood of the railing, feeling the solidity of it. He would look out at the thriving fields, the buzzing orchard, the children playing, and his heart would swell with a gratitude beyond words. He had learned to trust in the Lord with all his heart, and he had indeed made his path straight through the valley of shadow and into the wide, sunlit fields of grace. The legacy he was leaving was not just a farm, but a story that would be told for generations, a story that always began and ended with trust.